The day he threw me out of the house like a piece of trash. He never imagined that one day his life would rest in my hands. I hated him, but as a doctor, I swore I would never abandon anyone, not even him. My name is Marissa Keaton. I am 35 years old, a cardiothoracic surgeon. But before the white coat, before the steady hands and the long hours in operating rooms, I was just a little girl, an orphan who had nowhere else to go. When I was 10, my entire world shattered in one night. My parents were driving home from a late dinner. A drunk driver crossed the lane, headlights blinding, and then nothing. Sirens, screams, the phone call that ended my childhood. Instead of foster care, I was sent to live with my father's younger sister, Lorraine, and her husband, Reginald. I remember clutching my small suitcase on their porch, rain dripping from the gutter, and thinking maybe, just maybe, they would welcome me. I still had hope then. That hope died the moment Reginald opened the door. He didn't hug me. He didn't even say hello. He just looked me up and down and muttered, "Another mouth to feed." The room they gave me was the attic. The ceiling slanted so low I had to crouch near the edges. The bed was an old metal frame with springs that groaned under the smallest movement. The air smelled of mildew, the wallpaper peeling in jagged strips. Boxes of forgotten junk surrounded me as if I were another thing stored away. And on my first night, Reginald made the rules clear. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, voice like gravel. In this house, everyone earns their keep. Nobody eats for free. You want to stay? Then prove you're useful. That was it. No comfort, no warmth. Just a contract of survival. Meanwhile, Damien, my cousin, their only son, lived like a prince. He was my age, but our worlds couldn't have been further apart. His bedroom was downstairs, bright, spacious, covered in posters and trophies. He had a brand new game console humming on his desk, rows of Nike sneakers lined neatly in the closet. If he wanted something, he had it. If I wanted something, I learned to stop asking. The contrast was sharpest at the dinner table, or rather, my place beside it. They sat together, plates piled high, laughter filling the room. And me, I stood at the sink, sleeves rolled up, scrubbing until my knuckles cracked. The hot water stung open cuts, but I kept scrubbing. The dishes never ended. I still remember that first dinner. The roasted chicken smelled so rich I could taste it in the air. My stomach twisted with hunger, but my plate stayed empty until everyone else had finished. When they were done, I scraped the bones into the trash, washed their greasy plates, and only then was I allowed the scraps left on the cutting board. Lorraine caught my eyes that night. She saw the raw skin on my hands, saw how my shoulders trembled. For a moment, just a moment. Her hand moved toward me as if to offer help or kindness, or maybe even love. But the sound of Reginald's chair scraping against the floor made her flinch. She pulled her hand back, dropped her gaze, and the silence between us grew heavy. That silence, it was louder than shouting, because it told me no one would protect me, not even my aunt. So I learned to adapt. I became small, invisible. I learned to work without complaint, scrub floors, wash clothes, polish shoes, all before school, all after school. And I learned to hide my voice, because speaking up only earned me more punishment. At night, when the house was quiet, I curled on that creaking bed in the attic, holding the only thing I had left from my parents, a small rusted key from my father's workshop. It didn't open anything in that house, but in my hands, it became a promise. A reminder that somewhere out there was a door meant for me, a door I would find one day. I told myself, if I could just stay silent, just survive, maybe the storm would pass. But storms don't pass when the sky belongs to someone else. Silence became my armor. Silence became my prison. And yet, even silence has a breaking point. Even the quietest child will one day learn to scream. The scream inside me was waiting, buried deep, growing louder with every slammed door, every chore, every cruel word. I survived by swallowing my voice. But I knew one day that silence would tear itself open and the world would finally hear me. Every morning of mine began with the sting of bleach in my lungs and ended with the hard little click of Damien's bedroom lock. That was the rhythm of those years. Dawn was a bucket and a brush. Night was the sound of a key turning a door, closing a world that would never include me. I woke before the sun and crept through the hallway so the boards would not complain. I learned which plank near the stair sighs, which hinge clears its throat. I learned to breathe quietly while I wiped the banister, while I knelt on cold tile and chased grime from the grout, while I rubbed the tired face of the stove until my own face wavered in it. If I was quick, I could finish the bathrooms and start a load of laundry before Lorraine stirred. If I was perfect, Reginald might only grunt instead of scowl. I earned my place at their table with a sponge and raw knuckles. They called it responsibility. I called it staying. School was the only part of the day that felt like a door, even if it was only cracked. I carried notebooks soft with used pencils chewed to nubs, a backpack that had belonged to someone else long before me. When teachers asked for supplies, I smiled and said, I had enough. Enough is a slippery word. Enough can mean almost nothing. Damien had help for everything. He was driven to a fancy strip mall twice a week for lessons that promised to sharpen his future. They called it preparation for the college entrance tests. He came home with packets stacked like white bricks. He tossed them on his desk and wandered off to play. I had a lamp on my attic desk that flickered when the wind pushed the wires. I studied under that stuttering light, lips moving over vocabulary, fingers smudged with ink, eyes burning from the bleach that never really left my skin. When I faltered, I pressed the rusted key in my pocket and told myself to keep going. Keys do not open doors by wishing. They turn because a hand does not give up. At the school science fair, the gym smelled like glue and poster board and the sugary spin of hope. I had built my model from pieces other people threw away, a warped board for the base jars that once held peaches wire, that used to frame a picture of a family that was not mine. I painted carefully with a brush that shed its hair like a nervous cat. I tested and retested, logging results in the tiny handwriting I used when I was afraid someone might read my heart. Damien wandered down the aisle, eyes flat with boredom, until he stopped at my table. He leaned in and smiled the way boys smile when they see something they can pocket without consequence. He asked a few quick questions and then drifted away. A week later, his project appeared shining and confident, as if it had dreamed itself into existence. It was my idea, dressed in new clothes. It wore a fresh shirt and smelled like money. He stood on the stage and accepted praise while my hands curled around the edge of my table. The applause was large and bright, and it made the air thinner. I swallowed my voice so hard it scraped. The ribbon he received hung from his neck like a small sun. I stared at the floor until the sun set. When I went home, I folded my report card in thirds, smoothed the creases, and slid it under the bed. Honor roll, perfect marks. Words that might have made another child run through a house with joy. In my house, they were invitations to trouble. Good things brought questions. Questions brought anger. Anger brought chores that had no end. So my achievements slept in the dust where the spiders kept their secrets. Sometimes Lorraine tried to soften the edges. She would knock very softly on the attic door and slip inside like a guilty thought. Once she pressed a small jar into my palm, cheap hand cream that smelled like artificial almonds. For your hands, she whispered, and her eyes shone with a tenderness she rarely let breathe. But the floor creaked in the hallway, and Reginald's steps approached like a forecast. Her fingers flinched. She drew back as if my skin burned her. The jar disappeared into her apron. She left without looking at me. That was how kindness worked in that house, a beginning cut short, a gesture unfinished, a word that never made it to the mouth. I learned to be patient with myself the way no one was patient with me. After dinner, when the plates were stacked and the sink was a battlefield I had already won, I climbed the stairs and opened my notebook. I copied definitions. I scrawled practice essays. I taught myself to diagram sentences because I loved how order could be coaxed from a tangle. I loved how a clean line could carry meaning across a page the way a suture carries skin toward healing. Damien would pass my door on his way to bed. He would rattle his key on purpose, a little metal laugh. Then his lock would click and the quiet would tighten around my chest. He slept behind a door that said his world was his. I slept beneath a roof that reminded me I belonged to no one. There were days I almost spoke, when the guidance counselor praised my work in front of the class, when a teacher asked who had helped me build such a precise model, and I almost said the truth that help is not always a person, that sometimes help is hunger. Sometimes help is a rusted key and a stubborn will. But I kept my mouth closed. I had learned the price of being heard. The worst part was how ordinary it all became. The bleach, the aching wrists, the secret pride of a grade tucked into shadow, the way hope kept whispering even when I told it to quiet down. Ordinary can be a mercy. Ordinary can be a cage. On the nights when the wind blew and the lamp faltered, I would lie back and stare at the ceiling where old water had bloomed in crooked circles. I imagined the circles were maps leading out. I imagined I could climb the air like a ladder. I imagined a future where my hands would still work hard, but the work would belong to me. I imagined a room that did not smell like mildew. I imagined a door that opened when I turned a key and did not ask me to scrub anything in exchange. I was not brave every day. Some days I failed small. Some days I dropped a plate and it shattered, and so did I, quietly, in the way only a child can break without anyone hearing. But even on those days, I tucked my report card back under the bed and smoothed the dust with my palm. I told myself that paper would matter one day. I told myself the world was bigger than this attic. I told myself to keep breathing. I kept breathing. I kept working. I kept studying by the lamp that flickered like a heartbeat that refused to quit. And still, the mornings began with bleach. And still, the nights ended with that tidy little click. I believed school would save me. I believed if I was excellent enough, careful enough, quiet enough, a door would swing open all on its own. But houses are full of locks, and not all of them yield to merit. Some of them answer to power. Some of them answer to pride. Some of them answer to a hand that was never mine. I thought good grades would open the door, but the key, the real key, was in someone else's hand. When the letter slid into the mailbox, the invitation to interview for a scholarship, I could hear my heart beating in a different future. Senior year felt like a bridge I had built plank by plank. Mornings still began with bleach and cold tile. Nights still ended with the small click of a lock that was not mine. But between those edges, school glowed. I lived inside textbooks and lab notes, and the soft hush of the library that smelled like paper and patience. My grades were almost perfect, not because numbers loved me, but because work did. I wrote my essay about resilience, not as a slogan, but as a practice. How you keep showing up when no one claps. How a rusted key in your pocket can feel like a map. After school, I volunteered at the free clinic downtown. I logged more than 200 hours, not because anyone asked me to, but because I wanted to know what it meant to hold a stranger's fear and not look away. I learned the names of medications, by the way patients said them careful and hopeful. I learned to take a blood pressure without making the cuff feel like a threat. I learned how a kind voice changes a room. One afternoon, the guidance counselor called me in. She spoke softly as if hope were something that might startle. She told me the local Chamber of Commerce offered a scholarship, $20,000, toward college. She said my file fit the mission: community, effort, promise. She said the word medicine, and I felt something in me sit up straight. Pre-med. The words tasted like direction, biology and chemistry and long nights and longer mornings. A road paved with work, a road I was not afraid to walk. The invitation arrived in a white envelope that looked ordinary. I opened it on the porch with shaking fingers. Interview scheduled. Bring your transcript. Bring your essay. Bring yourself. I brought more than that. I brought the attic and the bleach and the ache in my hands. I brought the key in my pocket and the way the clinic smelled like rubbing alcohol and relief. I brought the promise I had once whispered to my mother that I would do something with this life that made the pain make sense. Of course, Damien applied too. His application was thinner than mine, not the kind of thin that means sleek, the kind that means air. But his father was a major donor. Money walks in first. Money knows everyone's name. The interview was held in a room with tall windows and framed photos of men in suits shaking the past by the hand. I sat in a row of plastic chairs with other students who smelled like starch and nerves. My name was called. I stood. I breathed. I walked in. A panel waited behind a table. Smiles that measured. Pens that clicked. I told them about the clinic, about the way a little girl clutched her mother's sleeve while I wrapped a bandage, about how the mother's thank you was so soft it almost broke me. I told them about studying under a flickering lamp and how I learned to make the light a friend instead of a complaint. I told them I wanted to be the kind of doctor who could fix the things that break without permission. Hearts, chances, silences. When they asked why medicine, I did not say prestige. I said purpose. I said I wanted to be useful in the kind of way that did not require permission from anyone who locked doors. I said I had promised my mother, and the room went very still. Then I felt it, a familiar chill at my back. I turned slightly and saw him near the last row. Reginald arms folded, expression flat as a closed book. He did not nod. He did not blink. He was simply there like a verdict wearing a tie. Questions turned sharper after that. One man asked how I would handle stress. I smiled as if stress were not already a house I cleaned every morning. Another asked what I would do if I failed. I said I would try again, not because it sounded noble, but because I did not know any other way to move. When it ended, I thanked them, hands, steady knees, not. In the hallway, I passed Damien. He grinned like he had been born for rooms like this. Later, I watched through the glass as he spoke casual and smooth, while his father shook hands with two members of the panel. A small circle of laughter opened around them. I stood outside it and felt the wind. Days stretched. I kept volunteering. I kept studying. I kept folding my hopes into neat squares and tucking them under the bed with the old report cards that still smelled like dust and effort. Lorraine asked once very softly how the interview went. I said, fine. She nodded like a woman speaking to the air. Announcement day arrived with a sun too bright for my comfort. The auditorium buzzed, parents in good jackets, cameras from the local paper, a podium that looked important on purpose. My counselor squeezed my shoulder. You deserve this, she whispered. Deserve is such a tender word. It bruises easily. They began with a speech about community and investment and the future. They spoke about lifting up deserving students. They spoke about merit and fairness and the next generation. I held the key in my pocket and tried to breathe like a person who belonged in her own body. Then a name was called, not mine. Applause rose like a wave and carried itself toward the stage. I stared at my hands and counted the tiny white scars bleach had etched there. I clapped because that is what you do when a room tells you who matters. I clapped while Damien walked up the steps and accepted a check that could have changed my life. He smiled for the camera with the ease of someone who had never been asked to earn his breathing, after people milled and congratulated and made plans for celebratory dinners. Reginald passed me without a glance. Lorraine stood at the edge of the crowd, eyes glossy lips pressed into a line that could not make a sound. My counselor found me and tried to be brave for both of us. There will be other doors, she said. I nodded, because nodding cost nothing. Outside, the sky had thinned to a pale gray. I walked home slowly, as if speed might shatter me. In the attic, I took out my essay and read it again. The words still felt true. They simply were not enough to turn the lock I needed. I lay down on the creaking bed and closed my eyes. I listened to the house breathe. I listened to my own chest answer back. I had thought excellence would open the door, but that door had a key. And the key, it seemed, lived in someone else's pocket. On the day they announced the winner, the name they called was not mine. My name was swallowed whole by the applause for Damien. And in that sound, I felt the tearing of a dream. I sat frozen in the auditorium seat, the air buzzing with claps and cheers. Damien walked to the stage with that careless grin of his, as if the ribbon and the handshake had been waiting all along. The announcer's voice rang through the speakers, son of a respected local businessman, winner of the prestigious Chamber of Commerce scholarship. The words wrapped around him like a crown, and around me they wrapped like chains. My hands curled into fists on my lap. The envelope I had imagined, the future I had dared to sketch in my mind, they dissolved into the hum of congratulations. I heard a few whispers around me. Some said his grades had never been that strong. Others said his father must be proud. No one said my name. When the assembly ended, students spilled into the halls, voices buzzing with plans, gossip, laughter. I stayed behind for a moment, staring at the empty stage. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, wind pushing ground crumbling. I thought if I moved too quickly, I might disappear. That afternoon, my email chimed with a single message, a polite rejection. Just one line. Thank you for your application. No explanation, no kindness. Just a door slammed in digital ink. I climbed to the attic that evening with my backpack heavy on my shoulders. The rusted key pressed hard against my thigh. I set it on the desk and stared at it, asking questions it could not answer. What is the point of working until your fingers bleed? If the locks only open for someone else. Dinner that night was chicken again, rich and golden, the smell weaving through the air like a taunt. Damien told the story of his victory in a voice loud enough to fill the kitchen. He spoke of the questions of how he had impressed the panel, of how the scholarship would change his life. Reginald leaned back in his chair, pride painted across his face like a second skin. Lorraine sat quietly chewing without lifting her eyes. I scrubbed the pan until my reflection blurred with grease. Later, when the plates were dry and the counter shone, I stood in the doorway of the living room. The television flickered across their faces. Damien sprawled on the couch, holding the newspaper that carried his photo under the headline, Local Businessman's Son Wins Distinguished Award. The words might as well have been carved into stone. I had been erased, neatly and publicly. I walked up to Reginald, my voice trembling but sharp. Why did you do it? Why take that from me? He didn't even look surprised. He tilted his head back, lips curling into a smile that had no warmth. Because that's life. You should be grateful you even have a roof over your head. His laugh was short, the kind that ends before it begins, like a door slamming shut. I felt something twist in me. Not just anger, something heavier, a recognition, a truth I had been circling without daring to name. In this house, gratitude was a leash. Every scrap of food, every night under that roof was dangled before me as proof that I owed them. Every kindness was a chain. And no matter how hard I worked, those chains could be yanked tighter at any moment. Behind me, Lorraine's hand brushed mine. For a second, her fingers closed around me, trembling. It was not a rescue, not even a defense, just a whisper of sympathy, the smallest signal that she saw me. But then her hand slipped away. She folded it into her lap, eyes downcast. She was trapped, too bound by fear, by the weight of her husband's shadow. I could not blame her. And yet her silence felt like another betrayal. That night I lay awake under the crooked ceiling, staring at the water stains that mapped out continents I longed to escape to. The rusted key lay in my palm. It had never felt so heavy. Dreams that once fluttered in my chest now sank like stones. I thought of my mother's promise, and for the first time I wondered if I could keep it. But dawn has a way of dragging truth into the light. The next morning, when I came down to the kitchen, Reginald stood by the door, arms crossed. He tossed a carton at my feet. Inside were my belongings folded carelessly, some not folded at all. 18 now, he said flatly. My responsibility ends here. He pulled a crumpled bill from his wallet, $20, and dropped it on top of the carton. Consider this your parting gift. His voice was final, like the slam of a gavel. Lorraine stood in the corner, eyes, wet lips, pressed shut. She wanted to speak. I saw it, but the words died before they reached air. Instead, she slipped a small scrap of paper into my hand when Reginald turned away. An address. A name. Helen Moore, my mother's closest friend. I stepped out onto the porch with the carton in my arms. The morning air was cold enough to sting. Behind me, the door closed. In front of me, the road stretched gray and endless. I set the carton down, tightened my grip on the paper, and whispered to myself. In this house, gratitude was a chain. But chains can break. And mine had just snapped. I learned that in their world, obligation was never love, and the very next morning, the rope they tied around me finally tore loose. He gathered my belongings into a cardboard box, as if he were sweeping trash from the floor, and I dragged my whole childhood across the porch. Graduation should have been a beginning. The tassel still hung in my room, the gown folded neatly in the corner of the attic. But in that house, there was no celebration, no applause, no photographs taped to the refrigerator. There was only Reginald standing at the door, his arms folded across his chest, his eyes flat with finality. You're 18 now, he said. My responsibility ends today. He bent down, tossed a wrinkled bill on top of the box, $20, a cruel echo of generosity, and stepped back as though I were already gone. I lifted the box into my arms. It was not heavy with things, but heavy with everything I had lost. Books too worn to sell, shirts too small to matter, photographs curled with age. I could hear the springs in the attic bed creak above me, as if the room itself exhaled its relief at my leaving. Lorraine lingered in the hallway, her face pale in the dim light. For a moment she reached toward me, hesitated. Then, when Reginald turned away, she pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. Her whisper trembled. Helen Moore, your mother's closest friend. Her eyes searched mine, pleading for forgiveness she could not ask aloud. Then she lowered her gaze, shrinking back into silence. I stepped onto the porch. The boards were slick with rain, the air cold enough to sting my cheeks. The attic window squinted down at me, a crooked eye that had watched me suffer for years. Behind me, the door closed with a sharp click, the final sound of a lock that had never belonged to me. I walked to the bus station, the box knocking against my hip, the paper clenched in my fist. The world felt wider than it ever had, and yet every step echoed with fear. At the station, the smell of diesel and damp wool hung in the air. I bought a Greyhound ticket with the $20, slipping the coins left over into my shoe for safety. The driver barely looked at me as I climbed the steps and settled near the back, the box on my knees like a shield. The bus lurched forward, carrying me away from streets that had never been mine. Raindrops pounded the windows, smearing the world outside into ribbons of gray. I pressed my forehead against the glass and watched the telephone poles stretch like endless tally marks. Each mile was a mark of survival. Each mile was a reminder that I had no one except maybe the name on the paper clutched in my hand. Hours passed. The bus groaned through towns that looked half asleep. Pawn shops with flickering signs, diners with cracked booths, churches with letters missing from their marquees. I thought of my mother. I thought of her laugh, the way it came quick and unguarded, and how it vanished forever in a single night. I thought of the promise I had made to her, whispered like a prayer before the accident, that I would grow into someone she could be proud of. The ache of that vow burned hotter than the hunger in my stomach. The rain followed us into the city, heavy and unrelenting. When the bus finally hissed to a stop, I lifted the box and stepped out into streets alive with noise. Honking horns, voices layered over one another, the thrum of life too busy to notice me. I followed the address on the paper block by block, each step slower than the last. By the time I found the house, the rain had thinned into a drizzle. A single porch light glowed warm and steady, as if it had been waiting. I knocked once, then again. The door creaked open. A woman stood there, silver streaks in her hair, her eyes sharp yet kind. She looked at me, truly looked, before her mouth softened into something like recognition. "You must be Marissa," she whispered. Her voice cracked, and then she pulled me into her arms. "You look so much like your mother." The box slipped from my hands, forgotten at our feet. For a long moment, I let myself be held the warmth of her embrace, melting years of cold silence. The words alone, "you look like your mother," were enough to undo me. I had been told for years that I was a burden, that I was lucky to even have a roof. Now in her doorway, I was not a burden. I was a daughter of someone worth remembering. Helen brought me inside. The house smelled of lemon polish and soup, ordinary and welcoming. She took my wet coat, set the box gently aside as though it mattered, and led me to the kitchen. She placed a bowl in front of me, steam rising, and I ate slowly, at first suspicious of abundance. But she urged me on with quiet nods, and soon I was scraping the bottom of the bowl. It was the first meal in years that had not come with a price. Later, she showed me the small room at the back of the house. The quilt was faded but clean. A plant leaned toward the window, thriving in its quiet corner. On the dresser, she left a jar of hand cream. "For your hands," she said softly, noticing the cracks from years of bleach and scrubbing. Her kindness landed in me like a seed finally finding soil. That night, I lay awake under a roof that did not demand my silence. The rusted key sat on the nightstand, catching the street lamp glow. Perhaps it had never been meant to open a physical door. Perhaps it was waiting for this moment to remind me that survival itself had been the lock all along, and I had finally turned it. In the morning, she placed a cup of coffee in front of me and pulled out a yellow notepad. Together, we wrote a plan: part-time jobs I could try, the financial aid office at the state university, volunteer opportunities at a free clinic. Her voice was calm and steady, never promising shortcuts, but pointing me toward a road that was real. I listened, pen in hand, hope rising like a fragile bird that had learned how to fly again. No one had given me an easy way out. No one had opened a golden door. But for the first time, I did not need a shortcut. I had a map. I had a place to begin. I had a hand warm firm reaching from the past, and I told myself, this is not mercy. This is not luck. This is the path that is mine to walk. No one offered me the easy road, but in Helen's kitchen, with her voice steady and her arms open, I found the right one. No one gave me a shortcut, only the right path, and I walked it with bleeding feet. That was how it began. Riverton State University, small, ordinary, nothing glamorous, but to me, it was the gate I had been chasing since the attic years. Helen let me stay in her house, and in return, I promised myself I would not waste the chance she had given me. My mornings smelled of coffee beans and disinfectant. I worked as a barista before class, the hiss of the espresso machine, my alarm clock, the tips barely enough to cover books. I learned to smile at customers, even when my stomach was hollow, even when my fingers trembled from too little sleep. By night, I worked as a medical scribe at the county hospital. I sat in the corner of exam rooms, typing every detail, watching doctors move with the kind of purpose I dreamed of. Their voices were calm, their hands steady, their decisions life and death. I thought someday that will be me. But between lectures, shifts and shifts again, my body broke in ways no one could see. There were nights I fell asleep over flashcards, woke with ink smudged across my cheek, my neck stiff, my chest heavy with doubt. Organic chemistry nearly ended me. Numbers and reactions blurred into chaos, my grades slipping lower each week. One night I threw the textbook closed and whispered into the silence. Maybe I can't do this, Helen heard. She came into the kitchen where I sat with my head in my hands. She set down a mug of tea and rested her palm over mine. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the despair. You do not need to be the best, Marissa. You only need to endure. Bend, do not break. I carried those words with me like armor. I retook the exam. I passed. Not with perfection, but with survival. When the MCAT came, I sat in the testing center with the rusted key in my pocket. I pressed it until my skin bruised, grounding myself with its weight. Questions stretched across the hours, my eyes burned, but I kept going. Weeks later, the score came 515. Enough. Enough to open the door I had been chasing. The acceptance letter from Great Lakes University School of Medicine arrived on a thin envelope that shook in my hands. I read my name again and again as though it might vanish if I blinked. Helen cried openly when I told her. For the first time in years, I let myself cry with her tears, not of loss, but of arrival. Medical school was another crucible. 4 years of anatomy labs that smelled of formaldehyde, of exams that stretched until dawn, of hospital corridors where the fluorescent lights never slept. I learned to carry exhaustion the way others carry handbags, always there, always heavy. But I also learned the sound of gratitude in a patient's voice. I learned the quiet nod of a professor who believed in me. I learned that the promise I made to my mother had a shape and it was becoming real. Then came residency. General surgery, 5 years of fire. Days bled into nights, nights into days. My hands shook the first time I sutured under a senior's gaze, but repetition forged steadiness. I scrubbed in until the skin of my fingers cracked. I rounded until my legs gave out. I studied until I no longer remembered what rest felt like. And still, I endured. Fellowship followed cardiothoracic surgery. The stakes sharper, the hours longer, the weight heavier. But I kept walking the path. Each scar on my hands, each hollow under my eyes, each strand of hair gone gray before its time, they were proof that I had not given up. The day I finally slipped on the white coat with my name embroidered, Marissa Keaton, MD. I thought perhaps the wounds of the past had finally closed. I stood in front of the mirror, the coat crisp, the letters clear. I whispered my own name aloud, Dr. Keaton, and for a moment I believed the child in the attic had finally been sewn back together. But scars are not erasures. They only cover what still lies beneath. The truth was, the coat did not erase Reginald's voice, did not erase the applause that drowned my name, did not erase the nights I hid report cards under the bed. It only gave me new armor to carry the old pain. When the coat bore my name, Marissa Keaton, MD, I thought the past had been stitched shut, but it was only a wound, covered, not healed. Under the surgical lights, I saw the face from years ago, the one who stole my dream, now standing beside me at the same table. When I signed as an attending at Cascadia Heart and Vascular, I told myself the past was done. A clean page, a new badge. My name shone on a locker door. The hall smelled of soap and cold metal, the air heavy with the quiet fear of mornings before dawn. I breathed deep and told myself I belonged. Orientation was meant to be routine schedules, protocols, polite introductions. I sat among the new hires, fingers folded back straight. Then I heard a laugh. One I knew too well. I turned, and the air in my lungs froze. Damien, my cousin. The boy who once stood on a stage holding a ribbon that should have been mine. The shadow of my uncle's power behind his smile. And now, wearing the same white coat in the same department, standing under the same crest of Cascadia. For a heartbeat, I thought it was a trick. But his eyes met mine, and he gave me a polite nod, as though we were strangers who had never shared blood, never shared a house, never shared a betrayal. I returned the nod steady, refusing to show the storm that rattled my chest. If fate had spun us into the same orbit again, I would not be the one to stumble. Days later, the shock deepened. I pushed through the heavy doors of the operating room, and there he was. Already scrubbed hands, lifted palms open for gloves. His smile rehearsed his posture, confident like he had always belonged under those lights. Not a guest. Not a visitor. He was assigned to my list. The whispers were true, connections had carried him where effort alone could not. Dinner photos with the right people. Glowing recommendations. What others called networking. I had only ever known as closed doors. Our greeting was brief, a nod, a clipped doctor, nothing more. But inside me, old wounds opened. I pressed my thumb against my breastbone and breathed in, out the way I teach patients who fear their own heartbeats. In conference halls, Damien shone. Slides, crisp citations lined like polished stones. Sentences flowing, practiced easy. People leaned toward him, nodding, smiling, softening their questions before they even spoke. He closed his laptop with elegance, walking away as though gravity bent for him. But the operating room has no stage. Its language is sharper. It lives in the moment between one breath and the next, when a chest is open, a heart exposed, and hands either know or do not. Our first shared case was straightforward. Names called, pause for safety, mask to mask, glove to glove. But when the sternum split and the heart rose under retraction, his fingers shook. Not wildly, but enough. A secret tremor betraying what polish could not. We finished. The patient did well. Still, I caught the nurse's glance, subtle, sharp. One whispered just enough to reach me. He's not ready. I said nothing. Whispers are small truths, and often the first warning of a storm. Before the second case, I tried to bridge. We sat over scans, vessels glowing pale on the screen. I traced a path with my pen voice, plain professional. He nodded quickly, too quickly, nodding as if it was the same as knowing. Inside the OR, he moved like he was reciting lines. But bodies are not scripts. They surprise. They resist. That day, a vessel narrowed where the scan had promised space. He froze. Just a beat, but long enough for air to thicken for the team to hold their breath. I stepped in, guided, corrected. The rhythm of the room returned. Afterward, he laughed lightly, brushed it off as a learning moment. He slipped out before the final count. I stayed scrubbing until my skin stung, staring at water spiraling down the drain, asking myself what was mine to repair and what the system would refuse to name. Pattern set like bone. He excelled at conferences. I held the floor in the OR. His reputation was polished by doors that had always opened. Mine carved by years of doors slammed shut. Still, I tried to stay steady. Each morning I walked the pre-op corridors. Families huddled in chairs, whispering prayers in their own tongues. A daughter rubbing her father's back. A husband clutching a paper cup like a candle. I spoke to each of them, promising care as if their loved one were my own. I meant it every time. It cost me something. I paid it gladly. Damien and I orbited each other like uneasy planets. He addressed me as Dr. Keaton, voice formal, careful. He laughed loudly when others stood near, fell quiet when we were alone. Sometimes he surprised me with a thought that landed just right, but more often his words sounded borrowed. Textbook knowledge, not lived skill. And then the third case, a repair. Challenging, yes, but within reach. The patient's steady eyes and trust pressed against me like both gift and weight. We scrubbed in, checklist done, first cut made, monitor steady, heart-lung machine humming like a distant tide. The choreography began, careful, precise, almost prayerful. Then the inflection point, a vessel thinner than expected, a wall more fragile than the scan had shown. The kind of moment where both knowledge and nerve are demanded in the same breath. Beside me, he stiffened. The tremor returned, a bird trapped behind glass. I spoke low, steady, offering a path forward, a bridge I had already crossed in my mind. He nodded, adjusted, but the hesitation stretched long and heavy. The room held its breath. And in that silence, I knew what the whispers had meant. Readiness is not in speeches, not in surnames whispered in high offices, not in polished slides or practiced charm. Readiness is the steadiness that does not abandon you when the stakes are sharp as a blade. By the third case, I understood the margin for error had vanished. And whatever waited on the other side of this choice would not be gentle. The monitor spiked and stumbled. Pressure fell. Sweat slipped into my mask, and Damien fell into silence. It began as an ordinary case. Prepped, draped, light steady, the heart open to our care. We moved in the choreography I trust, one breath, one stitch, one calm instruction at a time. Then the rhythm broke. The line on the screen shook like a frightened animal. Numbers dropped. The room tightened. An alarm grew teeth. I felt it first in the air, a change in the way the body spoke to us, the kind of whisper you only hear after years of listening. Check the anastomosis, I said low and even. Look at the outflow. Confirm venous return. Damien hesitated. His hand hovered, then pointed in the wrong direction. More pressor, he said. Maybe fluids. Hold, I answered. Do not push the pressure into a problem we have not named. I asked for the probe. Let me see. On the screen, a ghost of a flap wavered, where the suture line should have been smooth. Not a tear, not yet, but close. Close is a cliff. Suction a little. Retract. There, I said. Clamp above. I have it. My voice was calm. My inside was fire. The team tightened around the table in the way a good team does. Hands arrived before I finished asking. The hum of the machine deepened, loyal and patient. We revised the stitch. We released a breath as the field cleared. Pressure crept upward, shy at first, then sure. Color returned to the numbers. The alarm lost its teeth. Good, I said softly. Stay with me. I looked up and met the eyes of the perfusionist. A nod. The anesthesiologist's shoulders softened a fraction. Damien still had not spoken. We finished with respect, closed with gratitude. I went to the family and gave them the truth that leaves room for error. There was a complication. We recognized it. We corrected it. Your loved one is stable. They cried the way people cry when the floor stops shaking. I let them. I stood still and held the space. Back in the workroom, I began my note while memory was warm. Times, findings, what changed and why, the choice I made and the path it opened. My hand still trembled, not with fear, but with the release that follows a held breath. Much later, I opened the electronic chart to review the record as a whole. A second note had been added, Damien's voice in clean lines. He had written that he identified a drop in pressure and recommended escalation. He had written that I delayed. He had written that when I finally acted, the field was already unstable because of my choice. For a moment, I only stared. Then I checked the log that lives beneath every line. Timestamps, edits, a trail that does not forget. His entry had been shifted. Words moved after the fact to fit a story that made him taller and me small. I closed my eyes. I heard the alarm again. I saw his hand reaching the wrong way. I felt the silk of the suture in my fingers and the weight of a life in the palm of my hand. I am not perfect, but I know what happened, and I know what did not. I flagged the note for review. The charge nurse added her incident report. The anesthesiologist appended the intraoperative timeline. The perfusionist uploaded the flow record. Pieces of a day aligning into a single steady picture. The case went to committee. Risk, quality. Peers who understand that truth is not a weapon, it is a light. Still lights can burn. I slept little the night before. I dreamed of the attic and the stage and the way a room can decide who you are before you speak. The conference room smelled like paper and coffee and a kind of caution I have learned to recognize. They asked me to begin. I kept my voice clean, no anger, no heat, only the path of the case stable, then not then steadied again, because we looked where the body told us to look. Questions came. Did I consider volume? Yes. Did I rule out artifact? Yes. What made me suspect the line? Years. A feeling. A pattern in the field that did not match the pressure on the screen. Medicine is science. It is also attention. Then Damien spoke. He repeated his note. He said the word delay as if it were a fact carved in stone. He said he had urged action. He said he was relieved when I finally did what needed to be done. His voice was smooth, practiced. His eyes never met mine. The chair asked to review the audit trail. The analyst projected the underlayer on the wall. Times, edits, logins, a map of who wrote what and when. Silence settled over the table with a weight you could feel in your teeth. The nurse read her note aloud. The anesthesiologist added the exact moment he saw the change. The perfusionist pointed to the flow dip and the clamp time. The line from the echo flickered. There was the flap, faint but real, captured in the instant we saw it. I stood when they asked for closing remarks. My hands were steady now. My throat did not shake. I am not here to punish a colleague, I said. I am here to protect a patient. A system that indulges the unready, that looks away from tremors and smooths them with last names, will make our patients pay. I will not accept that. Not in my room. Not under my lights. No one spoke for a long breath. The chair cleared his throat. He said the committee would review the materials in full and respond in writing. The words were formal. The air was not. I gathered my papers with the care I bring to a wound that still needs protection. I stepped into the hallway and let the door close behind me. The corridor was quiet afternoon light pooling on the floor like mercy. For a moment, I thought I might finally release the ache that had lived inside my chest since the attic. I was tired. I was also unbroken. Then the handle turned. The door opened, and in the frame stood the last person I wanted to see. Reginald. He filled the doorway like a verdict, his jaw set. his eyes cold. Behind him, I could hear the murmur of the room chairs scraping paper lifted the slow machine of a system, deciding what it will believe. He looked at me as if the past were a bill I still owed. And I felt the old house rise up in the back of my throat, the attic, the cold, the box on the porch. But I did not step back. I did not lower my gaze. Because whatever came next would not find me small. Not here. Not now. Not after all the doors I had learned to open with my own hands. And when the meeting room door opened, the person I least wanted to see was standing there. Ungrateful. You are nothing but ungrateful. Reginald burst into the boardroom with the force of a storm. His face was flushed, his jaw locked, his eyes bright with the kind of anger that wants an audience. He did not sit. He did not breathe. He pointed straight at me as if his finger were a blade. You owe us everything. Reginald shouted. A roof, a plate, a place. And you repay this family by tearing down Damien. The room tightened, air thinned, chairs creaked, but no one moved. Reginald stood like a verdict. He talked about favors that were never favors, debts that were never mine. He lifted Damien with words the way a drowning man lifts a name above water. He lowered me with the old story, the attic, the charity, the way a stray should learn to be silent. I felt the past rising, the cold of a porch, the scrape of a cardboard box. I swallowed it down. I kept my voice inside my chest, where it would not set the room on fire. And then the fire turned on him. Reginald's hand went to his chest, not dramatic, desperate. A quick clutch beneath the sternum, as if he could hold the pain still. His words frayed. His skin turned the color of paper. A shine of sweat gathered at his temples. His breath shortened, ragged pulls that did not reach the bottom of his lungs. His left arm twitched. His knees shook. Reginald. I said, already stepping forward. He tried for another word. None came. The floor took him. Code blue. The shout split the hush. The crash cart slammed through the door. Gel. Pads. A jolt that jumped his body and left it shuddering. Voices braided together, numbers called drugs, pulled time, counted in looks rather than seconds. I pressed at the edge of the chaos because training lives in the body even when the heart is louder than the head. We ran Reginald to the catheterization laboratory. Dye bloomed on a screen like a storm cloud. The vessel did not open. Another pass. Another push. The blockage held as if welded shut by years and pride. The cardiologist lifted his eyes, the look that means we have reached the end of this road. Emergency surgery, he said. Now. The call went out for the attending on call. My pager answered with my name. For a breath I could not swallow. My hands remembered the night I was turned into a burden and pushed into the dark. The word ungrateful scraped its way up my throat like glass. I let the feeling pass through me, and not from me. I walked to scrub. Water climbed my forearms. The antiseptic bit my skin. In the reflection, I saw a girl with a rusted key and a woman with a steady gaze. I heard footsteps and turned. Damien. Damien was not the polished colleague from conference halls. Damien was a son with his world shaking. His voice cracked where pride used to live. Please, Damien said, fingers shaking, as if he could hold me in place. Please save my father. They say you are the best here. If anyone can, it is you. I did not answer with comfort. I answered with breath. I answered by walking into the light. The operating room waited bright and cold and honest. The smell of antiseptic. The soft hiss of air. The monitors whispering in a language I trust. The team looked to me, and the room gathered around that look. Scalpel. The first cut was clean. The second cut was cleaner. Steel parted flesh, and the story narrowed to a single strip of field where nothing else existed. Retractors opened the chest. The heart lay there, swollen, stubborn, brave. We placed lines. We called for the machine that would borrow his blood and return it with breath while I worked. The world shrank to gloved hands and measured words. Clamp, hold, suction. Now, I built a bridge for blood. Not for Reginald the uncle. Not for the man who threw me out. For the patient on the table and for the promise in my bones. I did not save him for family. I saved him because this is the oath I chose to carry. There was a lull when the heart hesitated, a hush that pressed into my ears until all I could hear was my own pulse. Then came the answer, a thud, then another. The rhythm found itself like a path remembered in the dark. The monitor steadied into a careful song. We closed with respect. Every stitch lay flat and true. Dressing settled like quiet. The lights felt softer, though I knew they were the same. I peeled off my gloves and felt the dents where the elastic had held me in place. They wheeled Reginald to recovery. I followed because the body does not know the word enough until the numbers say it. In the room, the machines hummed a steady lullaby. Reginald's face looked smaller, the power stripped away by tubes and tape, and the simple fact of being alive by the grace of other hands. I stood at the foot of the bed and let the night pass through me. The boardroom, the rage, the collapse, the run, the screen that would not give the blade that did. I let it all drain toward the floor where it could not drown me. At some point, Damien slid into the doorway. Damien did not speak. He did not need to. Fear had carved new lines into his face. He stood there with the humility that arrives only when love is losing and gaining at the same time. I gave him a nod that said we would talk when talk meant something. A nurse checked lines. Another adjusted warm blankets. The respiratory therapist fine-tuned air and ache. The rhythm on the monitor kept time like a metronome left on a windowsill, soft, steady, almost tender. Reginald stirred. Not a grand awakening, a blink that looked more like surprise than understanding. His gaze moved over the ceiling, the light, the curve of clear tubing, the shadow of my coat at the foot of his bed. He looked at me, and what lived in his eyes was not victory and not fury. It was shock. It was the small wordless knowledge that the person he had called ungrateful had lifted him back across a line he could not cross alone. I did not need an apology. I did not need his version of gratitude. The truth already existed in the room in the way Damien could finally breathe in, the way the nurses moved with ease instead of haste, in the way my hands no longer trembled now that the work was done. They took Reginald to the intensive care unit. The doors closed with a softness that felt like mercy. I stood in the hallway and let the silence settle into my bones. I thought of the attic and the porch and the old key that never fit any door in that house. I thought of the blade and the bridge and the steady beat that answered my hands. I had stitched Reginald's heart. I had done it without bargaining and without revenge. The past remained where it was loud, scarred, unrewritten. But the present was clear. I had kept my oath. I had pulled a man back from the edge. I had done what I promised myself I would do the night I became a doctor, heal even when the wound belongs to me. I stitched his heart back to its stubborn rhythm. And my own heart, though still mapped with old scars, kept time. Sorry. If those two words had a shape, they would stumble just like him. That was the thought in my head as I stood beside his bed in the ICU. Reginald lay there, pale, fragile, his chest rising and falling in uneven waves. The man who once roared at me, who threw me out into the cold as if I were nothing, now looked so small, so breakable. His eyelids fluttered open. His gaze found mine, hazy but searching. His lips moved, barely a whisper escaping. I'm sorry. Just two words. Not a speech, not an explanation. But his eyes told the rest eyes that once carried only fire and disdain, now heavy with something else, remorse, shame, and maybe just maybe a plea for forgiveness he couldn't shape into more than those two fragile syllables. I didn't answer. What could I say? My chest ached with a storm of memories, the nights I cried alone after he cast me out, the endless fight to become someone despite the weight of his rejection. But also the memory of the scalpel in my hand, just hours ago, steady, precise, saving the very life of the man who never wanted mine. I let my silence speak, and he seemed to understand. His eyes glistened, then closed again, as if the strength it took to say those words had drained the last of him. The world outside that room didn't pause. It kept moving, and with it came consequences. Damien, the cousin who once smirked at me, who wore arrogance like a second skin, was no longer untouchable. The medical board convened. The verdict was clear: negligence, dishonesty, unfitness to practice. His license gone. The power he clung to for so long stripped away. When he walked out of that chamber, shoulders slumped, avoiding every stare. He wasn't the man who once looked down on me. He was just another fallen name in a profession that demands more than pride. And then there was Aunt Lorraine. She had always been there, quietly, on the edges, carrying her own burdens. But that day, she broke. When she saw me, she didn't hesitate. She pulled me into her arms, the way a mother might cling to a child long lost. She wept, not polite tears, not restrained, but raw, heaving sobs that shook her whole body. "My girl, my brave girl," she whispered between sobs. I stood frozen for a moment. Then I let myself lean into her embrace. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel, to be held, to belong. When it was over, I walked out into the hospital parking lot. The Seattle sky had opened up, rain falling in soft, steady curtains. Drops pattered against my hair, rolled down my cheeks, soaking into my coat. I didn't shield myself. I let the rain wash over me, cool and relentless, as if rinsing away years of weight I had carried in silence. I unlocked my phone, my hands trembling just slightly, not from fear, but release. I dialed a number etched into me like breath. When the line clicked, I whispered, voice cracking, "Helen." I did it. There was a pause, a soft intake of breath, and then quiet sobs. No words were needed. She knew. She had always known what this fight meant. I closed my eyes, tilted my face to the rain-soaked sky, and for the first time, I felt free. Forgiveness. It isn't about erasing the past. It isn't about pretending the pain never existed. Forgiveness is the final stitch, the one that doesn't close the wound by making it vanish, but binds it so the heart can keep beating without tearing itself apart again. I had stitched hearts countless times in sterile rooms under bright white lights. But this was the hardest stitch of all, and maybe the most important.